Law from the Signature Bank Studios.
Only the biggest stories, only the biggest guests, and only the biggest opinions. This is AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Our next guest, a friend of the show, Don Boudreaux, penned a piece shortly after the election with former Texas Senator Phil Gramm, warning about Trump's tariffs, warning Trump about his tariffs, and I suppose trying to persuade him that tariffs are not the most beautiful word in the English language. But I wonder what a free market kind of guy like Don thinks about Trump using tariffs as leverage. The specific performance he got immediately from both Canada and Mexico when the threat of a 25% tariff was imposed on both of them. Now, I know there's some pushback with respect to some of the demands Trump made. For example, yes, Mexico is dispatched some 10,000 military to the border to provide additional security on their side of our southern border. But the foreign minister said, well, you're not going to, your deportations, you're not going to send Mexican nationals to Gitmo. Like, well, yeah, actually, we are going to do that if they pose public safety threats and unless you want to take them back. But if there's any pushback in taking them back, then that's why we're standing up that capacity at Gitmo. But it's just then the same thing with Canada. A lot of hue and cry, but ultimately, if Trump is able to use tariffs to get advancements for our national security interests, and perhaps even the reduction of trade barriers, more open markets in protectionist countries like Canada for U.S. Producers in a variety of sectors, then won't he have orchestrated a nice little piece of jujitsu? All the concerns about retaliatory tariffs dissipate into the net result. Well, let's ask a free market guy like Don Boudreaux, because we happen to have him.
I couldn't disagree more.
Well, all right. Hold on. I got to introduce you. Don Boudreaux is an economist, author, professor, co-director of the program on the American economy and globalization at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. You can also catch his musings at Cafe Hayek, which is a good blog if you're interested in matters economic. Don, all right, go.
I'm sorry. I jumped the gun there.
No, that's all right.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there is some, as you alluded to, there's some question about just how much Trump got in exchange for his tariff threats. As for using tariff threats to make trade between Canada and the U.S. and Mexico and the U.S. freer, it's already pretty free. The USMCA, under that agreement, we already have largely open markets amongst us. There's hardly anything on that front to gain.
Well, there's pretty severe quotas, and then tariffs once those quotas are exceeded, and like the dairy sector, for example, with respect to the Canadians.
So another point would be, first of all, I just think it's bad form to unilaterally violate a treaty. You know, it makes us look bad. You mentioned Phil Gramm. I've done a lot of work with him. I mean, he's certainly not a bomb throwing radical, and he says it just makes us look bad. You know, that we just unilaterally ignore our treaty obligations, and not only is it bad for obvious reasons, it's just a violation of our word. It is it's bad for long-term investment. So we enter into an agreement. And then if the policy seems to be, well, we can violate that agreement whenever we see fit because we want Canada or Mexico to change some particular policy that they're doing, then that makes investment both in the U.S. and in Canada and Mexico less certain. That makes it more dangerous because you don't know if you're an investor and you're setting up a plant here because that, in Mexico or Canada, the U.S., because that's where the lowest cost production is going to take place, and you plan to, ship or receive outputs or inputs from elsewhere. You don't know what the policy is going to be going forward. The uncertainty that this kind of jujitsu, as you call it, imposes on the economy is really bad in the long run. So I think it's just a terrible, terrible policy, and it's all combined with, you allude to this too a bit, it's all combined that Trump is just incoherent on trade. So sometimes tariffs are necessary to bring back U.S. manufacturing, to reduce the trade deficit, to get other countries to reduce their subsidies. All of which might be good, but then if they're good on their face for bringing back manufacturing, then we should just impose them anyway and not care about what other countries do. Trump just seems to like tariffs, and the impression I get is that he's just constantly grabbing for whatever excuse happens to be on hand at the moment, and says this is the reason I'm imposing tariffs. I
200,000 people died from fentanyl overdose, mostly accidental.
43 pounds of fentanyl came in from Canada last year. I mean, that's just ridiculous. There's no way that the restrictions on threats and restrictions in Canada is going to do anything to reduce fentanyl overdoses. Fentanyl overdoses, these are ultimately a product of high U.S. demand for this stuff. The drug war has been going on for decades. The idea that threatening tariffs is somehow going to be a major a benefit to America in making advances in the drug war, I just think is unrealistic, and I just don't buy it.
Well,
it just doesn't make sense to me.
Well, I mean, if you devote more resources to border security, I mean, you're not going to eliminate it. There's never going to be 100%, but you can further minimize the incursion of people in this country illegally, as well as illegal drugs entering this country.
But surely
you can't stop
accusing Canada of being a major source of saying that part of the justification for the threats of tariffs on Canada is the fentanyl when an imperceptible amount.
No. But I mean,
that shows the incoherence of the policy.
But that's not the argument. The argument is border security writ large, and that includes human trafficking and drug trafficking and people on the terrorist watch list, more of whom entered from our northern border than our southern border in the last 12 months. So, I mean, it's a border security argument that he's making overall. And my point to you, I mean, I agree with your point about the uncertainty it creates, particularly for investment, although, just because of the even worse policies of every other country in the world, not named Argentina at present, America is still a magnet for global capital. But part of the more pragmatic argument, even if you are not a fan of tariffs, and I'm not, is you have exigent circumstances. And I need to get compliance from our northern and southern neighbors right now if I am going to secure the borders, if we're going to stop all of these societal ills that have been associated with open borders. And so I'm sort of going beyond the treaty, the USMCA, as you said, and I'm creating uncertainty. But we have to do something now, and we need Canada and Mexico to be constructive partners in that.
So I agree with a lot of that. And I think the best way to make them constructive partners is not to unilaterally violate a treaty that he himself entered into. Deal with these issues separately. These are not trade issues. And to just yank at trade and say, we're going to use this and that, and that's going to bring about this outcome, I just think that's unrealistic. And it's counterproductive. Deal with these issues in separate kind of treaty negotiations, separate kind of negotiations. Don't threaten them with a unilateral violation of an agreement that he himself entered into just a few years ago, and think that is a way to build constructive, productive relationships with our southern and northern neighbors.
I know we've talked about this before, but since it's included in the first round, I'm talking about the Chinese Communist Party, your perspective there, because that presents another layering of difficulties where we have problems with the Chinese Communist Party's intellectual piracy, in addition to some of the other problems associated with those societal ills that are also coming from our northern and southern neighbors.
Yes, I mean I think China's a more difficult. Obviously, it's a more difficult issue than Mexico and Canada. China's an adversary in the way that these two other two governments are certainly not. But we have to be. I think we have to be open to recognizing these threats and taking judicious actions on a case-by-case basis to deal with them. But one of the problems with Trump's approach to tariffs, he just loves tariffs, and so when he says, "Okay, we're going to impose tariffs unilaterally across our imports from China," that's not a targeted approach. I don't see that does much to deal with national security concerns. The fact is, we do rely on China, as do other countries, for a lot of inputs that make our productivity higher. China relies on us, which doesn't, at some level, make China less likely to be aggressive against us militarily. I'm not saying it guarantees it. It guarantees no aggression. Obviously, it doesn't. But I would prefer a more sober, less shotgun-like approach. Across the board tariffs, I don't see as really addressing the national security concerns.
Yeah, I mean, the thing, Trump is complicated in this way because, I mean, my view on it, I'll get yours, is that he's not really like a philosophical autarkist, right? He's not, but it's more sort of cultural, but he's pragmatic as well. So if he can extract concessions and get a victory or advance his flag, for example, on border security, a little bit more, then he's willing to go back and forth. He's as much as he talks about tariffs, I don't think he's sort of dogmatic about it. I don't think he's an absolutist on it. I think he just sees it as leverage, and he loves to use the leverage that he has. That's what he learned in business, and that's what he's applying in politics, I suppose.
He thinks the United States is a company, and so people, and so he treats it as if he's the CEO of the company, and so we're not going to buy from you if you don't do what I want you to do. I think that's a categorically mistaken way to look at the matter. Of course, in some circumstances, using a tariff threat can persuade other governments. Adam Smith, a great economic, originator of economics, understood this. Of course, in some circumstances, tariff threats can lead to benefits, but you have to be judicious with them. You have to talk sense when you're explaining them, and he doesn't. Many of the things that he says he wants to achieve with his tariff threats are things that should not be achieved. The U.S. trade deficit with Canada, for example, as he calls it, it's an irrelevant factoid. It means nothing economically, but he thinks it means something. And so we get reasonably sensible objectives. Okay, we'll use tariffs to increase border security, mixed in with utterly economically incoherent claims, and it makes global investors and frankly sensible people question just how much trust to put in this administration on the trade front.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you. I agree with you that trade deficits don't matter, but there's a lot of economists who don't, too. A lot of those in your profession in academia that provide intellectual cover for that position, even though it's not a particularly reasoned one. Don Boudreaux, American economist, author, professor, co-director of the program on the American economy and globalization at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Don, thank you as always.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Connect with Dan and Amy on the AM 560 The Answer mobile app. Just text the word app to 64636 to download the app today.
Wesley Financial Group is not a law firm. If you own a timeshare, don't miss this public service announcement from Chuck McDowell, founder of Wesley Financial Group.
If you receive an unsolicited phone call or mail piece to discuss selling, renting, or especially canceling your timeshare, don't fall for it. If you really want out of your timeshare, hang the phone up immediately or throw that mail piece in the trash and contact your timeshare resort or Wesley Financial Group for assistance with your timeshare. As the only Inc. 500 timeshare cancellation